Hello, I'm Caroline Metcalfe. I'm the church historian for St Swithun's Church. Welcome to St Swithun's Church here in East Grinstead. I'm going to tell you a little bit about the history of the church, and we're going to do a bit of a tour. It can't be a complete tour because there's so much information, but I hope it will interest you enough to come and look if you don't know the church, or to remind you of things you do know if you know the church well. There has been a church on this site for about 1,000 years. It is at a crossroads, which was traditional for a church. And if you think about it, it's at the crossroads as the High Street and Church Lane. We think that the church was probably built in about the 900s. We don't know about the very early origins and dedication. There's an idea that it may have been dedicated to Edward the Confessor or St Edmund, but we don't have any proof of that. What we do know is that in the 900s, St Swithun was a very popular saint. He's buried in Winchester at Winchester Cathedral. In fact, he asked to be buried outside the cathedral, but a shrine to him was made inside. There is a legend that if it rains on St Swithun's Day, which is the 15th of July, there will then be rain for the next 40 days. Often the parish patronal festival is on the nearest Sunday to the 15th of July, and very often there's a big problem about whether to have the picnic inside or outside because of the rain. I think the history is best continued if we go inside and begin a short tour. We're going to stop in the church porch. Follow me. We know that the church was given to the priory at Lewes by someone called Alured, who was the pincerner or butler or steward to the Count of Mortain. And Alured held considerable amount of land, and he gave this church to that priory with some land to support it. At the time, Lewes Priory was a very large and important monastery. And so he was really wanting the monks to pray for him, his family and his soul after his death. As far as we know, this church was restored and embellished in the 1400s. And then in 1683, the old steeple was struck by lightning and was destroyed. It was rebuilt, and it lasted for about 100 years. But then there was a real calamity. On the 12th of November 1785, the whole tower fell, and it destroyed most of the medieval church. And it then had to be rebuilt. We have got a list of all the known clergy here, dating back to 1220. That board, we know that the words were written by W.H. Hills, who was the historian of East Grinstead, and we know that the artwork was done by Geoffrey Webb, who was a stained glass artist, and his trademark is a spider in the corner of his windows. We don't have a Webb window here, but that is thought to be his work. Now we'll go down to the back of the church and look at the few little bits that remain from the old medieval church. We'll start with this monument. It doesn't look much, but the three figures and the inscription come from the old church. It was meant to be a monument to Dame Catherine Grey, who died in 1505 and had been a lady in waiting at the courts of the queens of Edward IV and Henry VII. And she and her husband were important patrons of this church. When the tower fell, the monument must have been broken, and someone called Mr. Wakeham had pieces rescued, the inscription and the figures of her two husbands, both shown as young knights, young men in armour. Unfortunately, the wrong central figure was saved. That is not Dame Catherine, it's not even a lady, it's a male civilian. He's got a purse hanging from his waist and he's got long hair. And this may be why people were confused and thought it was a lady, but it's not. So it's not Dame Catherine at all. And in fact, she had asked to be shown in what's called a shroud brass. She asked to be shown in her winding sheet, but we don't think she was, because the antiquary William Burrell visited this church a few days before the tower fell, and he described 3 figures. He never mentioned a shroud brass. That is all that remains of Catherine's monument. Mr. Wakeham had the figures put into that base and then had his own marble monument added, and he refers to the ruin of the tower. So it's the one monument inside this church that refers to when the tower fell in 1785. And we must be grateful to Mr. Wakeham for rescuing the bits that he did manage to rescue. Now we'll go on to the back of the church, where there are 2 fragments from the old church. This cross and this crown, and then there's another piece here which has the initials MP, and these are all thought to have come from the church before the tower fell. The crown is probably a symbol of the Dukes of Dorset, who were also patrons of the church. MP, we're not sure whether it refers to Matthew Prior, poet, who was a protege of the Duke of Dorset, or whether it refers to Mary, Countess of Plymouth, who was born Lady Mary Sackville and who was also a patron of this church and chose the clergy. But that, with the monument to Catherine Grey, is really all that remains of the medieval church. Some of the stone may have been incorporated into the walls and pillars, but we can't see that now. We're going to look at some interesting features of the church, and we're starting in the churchyard. This is a memorial. It's not a grave, but it's a memorial to 3 people who were burnt at the stake in 1556 in July during the reign of Queen Mary Tudor. We know their names: Thomas Dungate, John Foreman, and Anne Tree, and in some documents she's called Mother Tree, so she might have been an elderly woman. We don't even know if they came from East Grinstead, but this was their place of death. We know that they were imprisoned the night before in the cellars at the shop that used to be Broadley's opposite. And occasionally there used to be tours of that shop, and you could go into the cellars, and I think there was an uncanny feeling down there, not a nice atmosphere. As far as we know, they would have been burnt to death and their ashes would have been just thrown in a midden somewhere. Nobody would have kept them because that would have been too dangerous. However, some ashes appeared in the 20th century, and Lady Musgrave thought that they must be the ashes of the martyrs. So she caused this monument to be made. But I think it's unlikely that the ashes had survived that long. It's a good tribute to 3 brave people. It must have been a truly terrible death. It was on a Saturday, on market day, to have maximum impact on the town, to frighten other people. There is a rumour that they were witches. That's wrong. Witches were sometimes burnt, but these were Protestants. They were not witches, but you still hear people saying that sometimes. So that's 1556. Next we're going to go into the corner of the churchyard to 1866, and then we're going round the side to the 1920s. So this is the final resting place of John Mason Neal. John Mason Neal was not the vicar of the church, but he was a clergyman, and he was the warden of Sackville College Almshouse, which is just over there. He was warden for 20 years, 1846 to 66. In his day he was very controversial. because he preferred the high church way of doing things, which wasn't then fashionable. But he did a great deal of good, and he also founded the Society of St Margaret, which was a sisterhood of nuns who went out to care for the sick poor. He's buried here in this splendid tomb that was designed by his friend, the architect G.E. Street. 100 years after his death, there was a service here in St Swithun's in his honour, and the then Archbishop of Canterbury came, and he was called Archbishop Ramsay. Very often there's a wreath on it at Christmas time because he was famous for writing the words for Christmas carols, and the most famous is Good King Wenceslas, which he wrote in his study at Sackville College, and it was first published in 1853. So we've gone to 1866, and now we're going round the corner to the other side of the church to the 1920s or 1930s. So follow me up the path. His wife isn't with him. We know she's buried at Fairlight Churchyard in Hastings, and they had 5 children, but the children aren't buried there either. So he's on his own, and his wife is buried where she ended her days, and the children were in different places, and his son in fact went to America. Yes, and this is the door I wanted to show. Here we are, it's famous for these 2 little mice running in opposite directions. This is the Hasty Memorial door opening into the church, put up in memory of a father and son called Hasty who did a great deal for the church. It is the work of Robert Thompson, who had a workshop in Kilburn in Yorkshire. He used traditional methods, a tool called an adze, to plane this wood very, very finely. And he liked the old craft ways rather than industrial mechanised ways. And he gradually made quite a lot of church furniture. And the story goes that one of his employees said, "It's funny that we make all this beautiful furniture for churches, and yet we're all as poor as church mice." And he thought, now what a wonderful idea for a trademark, and began leaving a little carved mouse on furniture and doors. And the people at the workshop, which is still run by his descendants, thought that this was quite an early example of the church mice. So it's a lovely thing to have outside our church. The craft work is superb. Each of those decorations is subtly different, and it's lovely to think of it being worked by hand. At the time, the vicar in the church magazine said they were 2 casual mice doing nothing in particular, which is a lovely description. We'll go on into the church now. We have a magnificent organ in the church, which is played by the most wonderful organist, Adrian. In times gone by, that gallery up there would be a minstrel's gallery with people playing instruments to accompany the hymns, but gradually an organ was introduced. There used to be a huge organ in that chapel over there, but when that was replaced, the organ pipes were moved up into the gallery there, and a new chapel could be created. Some of the old pipes are beautifully decorated, and some of them were incorporated into the new organ. The vicar, when the old organ was installed, was called Douglas Blakiston, and he had trained as an artist. So there are a few remaining organ pipes that show us his artwork. We could now go into the chapel there so that you can see some other organ pipes that he painted. So now we have the organ console there, but the pipes up in the gallery. These four were organ pipes from the old organ, and Douglas Blakiston used them as an unusual memorial to four people who'd died, and one of whom was his own son. And he's painted faces on those pipes right up there, high up. And the other was another one was a young man who was killed. So they're a very unusual and interesting memorial, and a tribute to Blakiston as an artist rather than as a clergyman. Now we're going to go on up to the higher altar. On the way, we pass this little prayer desk, which was the prayer desk of the Reverend John Mason Neale, warden of Sackville College, which came to St Swithun's Church. We'll move on. In fact, that cross is sometimes hung on the prayer desk, and that also belonged to the Reverend John Mason Neale. This statue was made in the 20th century, and it shows St Swithun, and the ducks at his feet represent rain, because if it rains on St Swithun's Day, it'll rain for the next 40 days. We don't know what he really looked like, but that is a 20th century sculptor's impression of St Swithun. Opposite, we're going to go and have a look, there's a statue of St Edmund. And there are two things about Edmund, the arrow and the wolf. He was an early Christian martyr killed by the Vikings, probably by having horrible arrows fired at him. And it is said that he had a tame wolf, and so the wolf is shown in this sculpture. That's a sort of just in case this church was dedicated to St Edmund before it was dedicated to St Swithun. Now we're going to look at this floor. This is a tessellated pavement made of chips of stone. We think that it was the work of prisoners. There's very little documentation about it. This chancel was reordered in the 1870s, and it was probably installed then. It has this beautiful pattern, a bit like a Roman mosaic, and it has this star symbol, a sort of eternal triangle, but we don't know why. It was believed that one of the prisoners involved in chipping the stone, making the little fragments, was Constance Kent. Now there's a book and a film called The Suspicions of Mr. Witcher, and it tells the story. Basically, in 1860, a little boy was found murdered, and the family, there was a lot of suspicion. It was at Road Hill House in Wiltshire. And 5 years later, the little boy's half-sister, Constance Kent, confessed that she had murdered him. She wasn't hanged, but she was sentenced to 20 years in prison. And in several different prisons, it's thought that she may have done mosaic work, including perhaps this, but it's very hard to prove, very little documentation. When she finally was released from prison, she emigrated to Australia, joined her nearest brother, and lived to be 100 years old. Whatever its origins, we have an object of quiet beauty in the church, a lovely addition to the church, but possibly with a horrible story behind it. Now we're going to go down into the body of the church and look at some of the stained glass that has a story to it. All the windows in St Swithun's Church are fascinating, but this is my favourite. This is the Oxford Movement window. The subject is Victorian, but it was installed in the 1930s. The central figure in the green is the Reverend Dr. John Mason Neale. He was the warden of Sackville College from 1846 to 66. He was never the vicar of St Swithun's. One of the things he did, as well as running the almshouse, was to found the Society of St Margaret, a sisterhood of nuns, and he founded that in 1854. He's depicted in stained glass outside Sackville College, and the quality of the portrait of him is almost photographic, and that's because his daughter, Catherine Ermenild, who became a nun and eventually Mother Superior of the Society of St Margaret that he founded, she gave the glassmaker Harry Grills a photograph of her father, and so this picture is taken from a photograph. Around it there are other churchmen who liked the same sort of thing as John Mason Neale, the high church way of doing things. On the right-hand side you've got Nathaniel Woodard, and he's holding in his hands a model of Lancing College. He founded public schools for a Christian education for boys and later girls as well. And Lancing College has a splendid rose window. I think this is showing him with the chapel unfinished, and he trusted to God that the money would be forthcoming to finish it. Below him is John Keble, and he was John Mason Neale's friend and fellow theologian. He has no Sussex connections, whereas Woodard founded public schools in Sussex, such as Ardingly, Hurstpierpoint and Lancing. Coming over to the other side, at the top we've got Dean Walter Farquhar Hooke, who was at Chichester Cathedral for a time, and in that time one of the spires fell down, and that's why he's holding the spire, because that had to be repaired. At the bottom is Hugh James Rose, and he was a clergyman, and the four depicted around the outside, they met in his study and founded the Oxford movement in sort of 1833. And they wrote letters to the Times called tracts to the Times, and that's how they became known as Tractarians. So this monument, although it depicts Victorian scenes, is from the 1930s, but it also has something very medieval in it. The lowest panel of all has 9 panels or quarries with symbols to do with the Merchant Taylors' Company, and they are much older. That, I think, is because the vicar at the time had been to the Merchant Taylors' School, and when it closed, he bought those pieces to put into this window. So although it has no direct connection with John Mason Neale, I think John Mason Neale would have been very interested in the history. So there's a lot to think about when you look at that window. Now we're going to look at something a bit more modern. These 5 windows in the clerestory or clerestories is the way some people say it. They were decorated in the 1980s. The central panels show 5 scenes from the very early life of Christ. They're very interesting in their own right, but an unusual feature is that in the surrounding panels you can find animals. And it seems that the donors gave some money in return for having their pet dog or cat shown. So very briefly, the one over the altar has 2 dogs. It has a spaniel one side and a bulldog the other side at the sort of 1:45 and 1:15 positions on the clock. We think the spaniel was called Tiffany and belonged to the vicar at the time, and we think that the bulldog was called Johnny. The next one has a dog on the right-hand side at the sort of 1/4 the hour position. The next one has a cat with enormous eyes. The next one has another dog. But the last one is different. It has a guinea pig, and it's a flying guinea pig. And it's at the 3:15 position right up there. And that has a wartime connection. So it's time to tell the story. During the Second World War, young airmen, particularly fighting in the Air Force, had terrible burning injuries, often to their faces. And Sir Archibald Macindoe at the Queen Victoria Hospital treated them. And his treatment was pioneering, revolutionary. It involved salt baths and things like that. And some of them had to have multiple operations. They grew new skin on different parts of their body, and then that skin could be used on their faces. And they looked very strange during their treatment, with what I think was called a pedicule coming off their nose, quite a long piece of skin. East Grinstead was known as the town that didn't stare at these poor young men having this really difficult treatment. Because it was so unusual, they called themselves the guinea pigs, and they had a special club for those undergoing multiple operations. And they had a wicked sort of sense of humour which helped them to get through all this. I believe that the treasurer had no legs, so he couldn't run off with the money. The secretary had badly damaged hands, so that the minutes had to be short because he couldn't write for very long. That sort of humour, which sounds dated to us now, but mattered terribly at the time and kept up their morale. So that is why we have a guinea pig in St Swithun's church. People come in expecting to see something that looks like a pet you might have at home. It's not, it's a flying one, and it symbolises these airmen who sustained such terrible injuries. Thank you for watching. If you know the church well, I hope it's reminded you of some of the highlights. If you don't know the church, do come and have a good look. There's much more to see, and there's much more to find out about. There are some articles on our website at St Swithun's, and there's more work being done to find out more stories. Come and tread where people have trodden for over 1,000 years and follow in the footsteps of the faithful. Thank you.